Napoleon in Europe, 1799 to 1815. Now, what follows are 8 possible LEQs, perhaps even DBQ questions concerning Napoleon. So what I'm going to present here is the historiography, or some historiography, concerning the Emperor Napoleon under several different topics. So we're going to look at the issues in a minute, but the main content down below. One could spend a great deal of time looking at nothing but Napoleon Bonaparte and be completely satisfied with a survey of European history, no doubt. However, it comes right down to it, the nuts and bolts of it probably will be a little bit less on the military and a little bit more on rise to power, domestic policies, perhaps even, grand strategy, maybe, and then the downfall of Napoleon, or mainly, as it says in some of the questions up above, his impact on Europe. So I'll briefly go over these. We're going to deconstruct these quickly and then get into some historiography, some authors that may be a little bit off the beaten track. The main author, by the way, in case you didn't already know this, would be David Chandler. David Chandler is the end-all and be-all of authors concerning the Napoleonic period, especially when you talk about anything military. David Chandler says this, David Chandler supports this, and you will be golden because he is the man. Let's see, what factors shaped and what were the effects of Napoleon's reform in France under the consulate? So again, time frame. You need to know what we're talking about, and we're only going to take this as far as 1803, 1804, simply because Napoleon will crown himself emperor on the 2nd of December in 1804. The chronology for number 1 is pretty tight, 1799, 1804. However, there's an awful lot that goes on during that particular time period. Again, look at the beginning part, the question stem that this prompt begins with, and that is, what factors shaped Napoleon's reforms in France? Well, clearly, you're going to need to make reference to one revolution after another, the settlement of the Directory, and the kind of capture of the state of a small clique of bourgeoisie, which was, for many reasons, unsatisfactory. And then what were the effects of Napoleon's reforms? Well, you'd have to name them. And if this is something like an LEQ and you've only got 35 minutes, then you have to make some pretty big decisions. Luckily enough, focusing on the Concordat with Rome in 1801, the Civil Code, education reform, those are the 3 biggies, and that's what an awful lot of people are going to talk about. You could talk a bit about roads and infrastructure, talk about attempts at, not totally fulfilled, but agrarian reform, and some other elements that you could bring into play. Number 2, and this is an interesting beginning to a prompt, should Napoleon be viewed as the heir to the revolution, an enlightened despot, or a mere dictator? Now, clearly, considering a thesis statement, we want a hard-driving thesis statement that's going to establish, maintain, and win an argument. So you're going to need to choose one of those 3. Perhaps we consider how they're ordered and maybe even some of the wording involved. For instance, mere dictator. I don't know if you identify that, but that seems to be a little bit of a setup. Clearly, we need to consider Napoleon as being more than just a military dictator. More than that. Perhaps an enlightened despot. Why not? Who are his heroes? Let's think. Frederick the Great. Frederick the Great was certainly an enlightened despot. And again, a hero of Napoleon. So you could say through emulation, if nothing else, that Napoleon was an enlightened despot. And here, heir to the revolution, son of the revolution. You might be able to do some clever rewording toward a phrase that you feel a little more comfortable with, but it is in keeping with what the prompt had suggested. That's going to take, and it will, of course, a little bit of work. Depending on how well schooled you are in preparation for this exam, I think it might be a little too easy to just say mere dictator and denounce and trounce and debunk all that the emperor was about. And it might be, of course, maybe a little ambitious to try to paint him as the heir of the revolution. There are certainly a number of negative factors which come into play which do distract from what he felt, of course, that he had saved the revolution and was the heir to, or perhaps even the son of, the revolution. Now, 3, it says here, should Napoleon be regarded as a military genius? Big distractors come into play. Clearly the Waterloo campaign, the Battle of Leipzig in 1813, the failure of the continental system, and the decision to invade Russia. Up to that point, and I guess I would say something like the 1812 campaign against Russia, up to that point, it's a little difficult to distract from the genius of Napoleon. Clearly, you could use the Ulm-Austerlitz campaign in 1805, exemplifying him as a military genius. And then here you can differentiate, and you can say, well, on the battlefield, Napoleon was and reigned supreme. Karl von Clausewitz, who wrote On War, called Napoleon the god of war. And certainly Napoleon being one of the most written about people in history, mainly, of course, for his military exploits, one would consider that military genius would be something to prove. Here, I think it would be important to acknowledge that his genius is one of synthesis, that he brought together many other innovations that had predated him and wielded them with an unusual prowess, no doubt. Why was Napoleon so successful in Europe up to 1807? And that is prior to the invasion of Spain, being bogged down with the Spanish ulcer, the continental system, etc. And there, in 1807, that's the treaty made with Russia with Tsar Alexander I, the Treaty of Tilnitz. Yeah, I think that is why 1807 was chosen, and that's when Russia had been on board with the continental system. So why was Napoleon so successful? Here, categorically, I think we have to consider political success, economic success, military success, etc. Again, if it's an LEQ prompt, something like this, they either may or may not give you a date like that. They might even extend that up to 1815. If they were to extend it to 1815, then you're in a little bit more of a pickle as far as trying to prove his success. But up to 1807, after the Jena-Austerlitz campaign, when he had humiliated Prussia, you're pretty good to go. You've got an awful lot to run with. And this clearly is going to include after the coup, so 1799 on. And in that case, you've got a great deal of ammunition to work with. The next one, why, causation question, was Napoleon so successful for so long in Europe? Now, if in the context of what we looked at with number 4, for so long, so we're looking at, approximately 10 years. And why was he eventually overthrown? Well, again, overthrown's a little problematic in this question. It is not to say that the people rose up in rebellion against him. His military defeat in 1813 in Leipzig did lead to his first abdication. Let us not forget that. And then, of course, his escape from Elba, the 100 Days, the Waterloo campaign. And again, overthrown here would be overthrown by the other major powers. And the Battle of Leipzig is known as the Battle of Nations, and Waterloo, while a near-run thing, certainly, even if he had won, which he probably could not have won Waterloo, he was going to be faced with another 100,000 Russians and other allies heading toward Belgium, heading toward France. So that would have been very difficult. So here it's so successful for so long. You're going to be best to take that up to 1807, and then the eventually overthrown is the development of continental system invasion of Russia, Leipzig, and then end, of course, with Waterloo. And what was the impact of Napoleon on Europe? Long term, even to this present day, one has to cite the Civil Code. In France in particular, but France did provide models of education and education reform for many other countries in Europe. Certainly, no doubt about that. So, beyond that, though, the impact of Napoleon on Europe, despite Leipzig, despite Waterloo, Napoleon did revolutionize military affairs in Europe. And this is best articulated by Karl von Clausewitz and Baron Jomini and many other writers, but those are the two who were the most influential. As far as military theory, military doctrine, military practice is concerned in the 19th century, up to and including the Great War, Napoleon fundamentally inspired all the literature that, I hesitate to say, educated the generals that fought in World War I. But certainly influenced them. Of course, had they read past book 1 of Clausewitz, they might have actually got what he was trying to say about the emperor. But the impact on Europe, depending on how far you really want to go with this, or if your approach is going to be deep or it's going to be in short term, the focus is on the 19th century. You would not want to exclude the Congress system, the Congress of Vienna, and the subsequent Congresses that helped to maintain a balance of power in Europe for quite some time, up into at least the Crimean War. Until the Crimean War. And then you could safely make an argument that from 1815 to 1914, Europe, the world, had not experienced a war as large as the Napoleonic Wars, or as intense. What factors helped explain Napoleon's downfall? Well, there is the man and the man himself, and he does suffer from megalomania and kind of refuses to take counsel from his marshals. That does become a little bit of a problem. He had always had a bit of a problem with articulating his commands to his subordinates. Wellington says that Napoleon on the battlefield is worth 40,000 men, and in the absence of Napoleon, his marshals weren't always as successful as they would have been with him present. So it will be a military rise and factors pretty heavily focused on a military downfall. One thing that is oddly absent with Napoleon is a true and clear understanding of grand strategy, of bigger economics, of perhaps something that the British had a century ahead of success that they were working with, and that's strategic patience. And I think if you were to perhaps read Paul Kennedy, maybe peruse, again, a little bit of David Chandler, these points are pretty well articulated as to why he didn't understand naval affairs. He made very good economic reforms, but they were minuscule compared to what needed to be done for France. And being at war for 15 years constantly, this doesn't allow an economy to really reform and move ahead. Remember, the British had a very long time of economic reform. Prior to the Glorious Revolution, and certainly after 1688, they are on the process of a great deal of real, meaningful, thorough economic reform. And this is something that just could not be done in the short time that Napoleon was at the helm. However, the factors that did explain beyond Napoleon and him not understanding, or not really having that grand strategic vision as the British did, would be, as we have discussed before. I think it's the announcement of the continental system, the Spanish ulcer, the invasion of Russia in 1812, 1813, it is all fundamentally over for Napoleon. So there's 250,000 books at least written about Napoleon. I'm not sure off the top of my head how he ranks as far as a person to be a topic of literature generated. Clearly, he's in the top 5, no doubt about it. And again, this legend of Napoleon. And, the bulk of the 19th century literature about Napoleon is generally flattering, generally positive, generally supportive. There is also a huge corpus of literature that would defame Napoleon in a number of different arenas. The general interpretations one can basically put into 2 camps. He is either the heir to the revolution, the son of the revolution, albeit perhaps an imperfect child of the revolution, or he is a betrayer of the revolution. Now, those who may camp on the side of betrayal have some pretty good company. Beethoven, for instance, is an individual who thought that he betrayed the revolution, especially when he crowned himself emperor. And I do believe that is the beginning of the betrayal narrative. We start with 1804, and the emphasis upon destroying the Holy Roman Empire after he had defeated Prussia, the carnage in and of itself. You may have studied Robespierre, the Reign of Terror. Depending on what the statistics are and how you interpret them, anywhere between 15 and 40,000 die at the hands of these Jacobin revolutionaries. Well, very good, but one Napoleonic campaign would result in 40 or 50,000 casualties anyway, if not deaths. So the number of deaths is really a bit elusive when we talk about the severity of the Reign of Terror in comparison to perhaps Napoleon's continuous warfare. More than 1 million Frenchmen are going to die marching with Napoleon. So there is an awful lot to go with either side. I don't think either one is easy to consider convincingly, and there will always be a caveat one way or the other. What usually doesn't get dealt with and dealt with well is the domestic rule of France. And what always ends up being a distractor is too many people will talk too much about censorship, talk about spies, talk about a small electorate, talk about using the plebiscite as a dictatorial tool. Okay, fair enough. Certainly that does happen. However, one needs to understand Napoleon's not going to be in Paris. He's not going to be there. He's going to be out and out campaigning. Thus, he wants to ensure that there are no attempts to hijack the state in his absence. And of course, the main concern of any of these French revolutionary governments and Napoleon's government is trying to make sure that one controls the masses. I've already talked a little bit about Napoleon as a military leader. Indisputable, a great military leader. So you want to make sure that proportionally you don't focus too much on his failures, although clearly he will fail. Do remember that he's been extremely successful from 1793 on. So for 20 years until 1813, he's been extremely successful. So proportionally, you don't want to put too much emphasis on Leipzig. You don't want to put too much emphasis, especially on Waterloo. And that is what too many people do, in their attempt to distract or to vilify or to paint him as a betrayer of the revolution. Far too much emphasis on Waterloo, ignoring everything else. And chronologically, that's just the way it goes. It is his last big campaign. He does have literally his Waterloo. After that, he is in exile in Elba, far, far away, and there will be no next 100 days. So, Napoleon is not the first person to consider with the great man theory of history, Thomas Carlyle, but he is a great example of a person who does, for the most part, I guess, exploit opportunities in his environment to his favor, rather than saying, he pulls himself up by his bootstraps and he's a self-made man. I think maybe exploiting the environment to his favor might be a better way to put that. Napoleon's impact on Europe, great and profound, no doubt about it. I don't think there's a person in the 19th or 20th century that reached the heights of stardom that a Napoleon did. We are still, right now, talking about him today, but it would be encased in the success, the lasting success of the Code Napoleon. There are many other elements, and again, I think you would emphasize the military incorrectly here. It would be a bit of a jump, fair enough, to say that the Empire of Napoleon in 1810 is essentially, or was essentially, what was envisioned for the EEC or the European Union a little bit later on. Not too far-fetched, of course, but I think a bit too much for a chronological jump. Might be able to tie influence upon, the German Kaiser Wilhelm II, German grand strategy closely after their unification, even Hitlerian foreign policy, which, outside of his incredibly racist agenda, was quite similar to that of Kaiser Wilhelm II, and clearly had the idea of something like a Napoleonic vision for Europe. But the bourgeoisie are the great legacy of Napoleon, and it is by them and through them and with them that he was able to rise, able to stay in, and we have this maintenance of a legacy of Napoleon. And I suppose you're going to feel relatively tempted to throw in a Louis Napoleon, a Napoleon III reference. He is not the resuscitation of the emperor in any way, shape, or form. And I think, of course, his career points that out plainly, especially the Battle of Sedan, him being captured, and, of course, the end of Napoleon III. Okay, there are several authors that will follow, and these quotes, I think, are pretty straightforward. They're mainly a little bit different than what you would find anywhere else. Often what you will find are Napoleonic quotes about himself, recorded on St. Helena. Other interpretations will follow a little bit later on, and those are historiographical interpretations, not necessarily quotes from contemporaries, like these. But these are certainly worth a bit of a perusal. And again, these are off the main radar. They're not a David Chandler quote. They're not from the top 5 historians, but they still give us a great deal of insight, and they do come from different levels of scholarship. For instance, Johnston is not a professor, not a PhD, not a major historian, but still, Domination, some Napoleonic episodes, was a very popular book, and a popular book at the time, and it did gain scholarly appreciation. And some of these are just fantastic, and they throw a little bit of a different light on Napoleon. Headley, in Headley's quotes, I think show a great deal of balance. I think they provide for you some interesting analysis, easily remembered and probably easily applied. Now, there will be a series of interpretations of secondary sources from major historians that are going to follow. I'd like you to make sure you read this over. This is essentially, I guess you'd call it a rubric. And what it's meant to do is kind of shape the idea of how you would respond to the prompts that follow. This is nothing you don't already know as far as guidance for a response to a history prompt. However, I think it's good to see it all in one paragraph, and then what I would do is I would take this out, and in my own words and in my own handwriting, I would make a bullet list and kind of a checklist of how I would respond to these questions that follow. Now, these are relatively large excerpts. This is something at its extremity you would find on the redesigned DBQ. And that is what you would expect to be reading now for sources. You know, anything else is going to be considered to be something of a quotation that might be referred to in an LEQ. But here it says, using the 4 passages and your own knowledge, assess the view that Napoleon introduced a police state into France. So contained within the next 4 sources from these historians will be information that will lead you toward an assessment, and again, a judgment, the degree to which France was a police state under Napoleon. You're going to need a comparative model. So the only other contemporary comparison you can make would be France under the Jacobin, under the Committee of Public Safety and Robespierre. That's quite important. Now you could also look forward and say that after we have the Bourbon Restoration with Louis XVIII, Charles X, Louis Philippe, you could make a comparison afterward as well. Okay, with of course focusing on the information in the sources. You wouldn't be expected to put too much of your own knowledge in here, but that is clearly a hint for comparison with a couple of other time periods. And I would keep this in France. I don't know, you might be tempted to look at the Hitlerian state or the Stalinist state. That wouldn't quite be appropriate here. They're really trying to look for French examples. And I think it might be best or easiest to do that comparison with the Reign of Terror. Now we're not going to read these over, but certainly you'll take the time to consider what they have. Now again, these are all secondary sources, and they do come from historians, and you either do or do not know the authors that are involved here, or you may or may not have perused these books. Not necessarily the point. What's going to be taken for an extract is going to be certainly enough for you to make a valued judgment upon. So here's another set of 4 sources. Use the 4 passages and your own knowledge. Assess the view that Napoleon was principally motivated by the desire to benefit himself rather than to benefit the people of France. Okay, so again, how many ways can you actually write a question up? Was Napoleon just a mere dictator? Was he an enlightened despot? Or was he the heir to the revolution? Now, benefiting the people of France, again, whatever you chose earlier for achievements, Napoleonic achievements certainly come into play here. Bank of France, education reform, civil code, etc. Those definitely come in. With the desire to benefit himself and this idea of glory, this is nothing unusual for our French leaders of state, or for the French in general, trying to achieve glory. Like Louis XIV, maybe Napoleon might have whispered under his breath on his deathbed, I loved war too much as well. You might want to try to consider that as you peruse these sources. By the way, Gerard, down here in 1957. That is a absolute classic. And most of these authors are European, and most of them are British authors. Here's another set. It says, using the four passages in your own knowledge, assess the view that Napoleon himself was most to blame for his downfall. Well, goodness, he's the leader of the army. He is the head of state. You are going to have to place a bit of emphasis upon him. Otherwise, it would be a little bit difficult to actually formulate a causal framework around those who supported him, since this is a centralized state. Looking at his family, who are all appointed monarchs of conquered territory, Joseph, Pauline, they played a role, but a minor role. And they were, for all intents and purposes, unschooled toward the administration of states, especially in a monarchical role. So they're a little bit difficult to blame a lot upon. I think you look further afield and you look at some of the other countries that were playing a very diligent role in trying to bring about his downfall. And of course, the focus there is going to be on Britain. Britain is the hub of all of these coalitions. They fund the coalition, they're directing the coalition. And of course, if you take it to the very bitter end in 1815, you are looking at Britain and Prussia defeating Napoleon at Waterloo. And that is clearly his downfall. But again, do not forget Leipzig, 1813. It is really over with at that juncture. In 1814 and 1815 are merely window dressing. But here we go. Take a perusal of these sources in consideration of that prompt. Now this last one, there are altogether essentially 5 questions. And the documents that will follow, I'll give you some more guidance for the response immediately afterward. This one is really asking you to look at his campaigns in particular. And this is 1800, so Marengo all the way up to 1814. So this does not include the campaign of 100 days. This does not include Quatre Bras or Waterloo at all. All right, so you wouldn't consider that in answering this question. So, again, when a particular date range is presented, it's probably good to stick well within it, because that's what they're asking you to recall. So A and B, here's where you're going to use some of your source evaluation skills, and we need to address the Prussian campaign of 1806. That's the Battle of Jena and Austerlitz. That is almost equally as brilliant as Austerlitz itself. But let's look down at 2, 3, and 4. Napoleon's rise to power by 1799. So here it is him as a military person rising up. Siege of Toulon in Toulouse in 1793, and then the whiff of grape shot, and then the Italian campaign, and then in Egypt and his return for the coup. What was the greatest contribution made by Britain to defeat Napoleon was the Peninsular Campaign. So the Spanish ulcer is, of course, what you want to focus on. And it's a very vigorous counterinsurgency campaign. This is the unwitting impact of French revolutionary nationalism on the Spanish people. This could be, in a sense, directed a little bit toward Joseph, his brother, who is the appointed king of Spain. But the defeat of Napoleon, again, looking at the dates, we're looking at 1813, and then his abdication in 1814. So that's Leipzig. That's after the Russian campaign. So I don't think we play our hand too heavily with the Peninsular Campaign. Okay, we need to pay some attention to some of the other factors: continental system and Russia. In the rule of his European empire outside of France, Napoleon should be seen as more of an oppressor than a liberator. Well, how valid? I would start off considering that he and the French army certainly were liberators and that they did liberate the people. And if we're going to talk about oppression, then it is the tribute that was expected to be paid to Napoleon, to France, for their maintenance of order through their occupation. And again, occupation armies are never really looked upon very favorably, no matter what they had brought initially to bear. All right, so here's some guidance for the questions. There's 2 slides here. And like the other set of guidance, this is pretty bang on. This is exactly what you need to be looking for. And I would make my own handwritten checklist accordingly. And I would also make sure that not only am I making a checklist, but I can fulfill that checklist. So this is why you have these practice questions and some sources, so you can take the time to work with. What was presented was a mixed question. So you've got some source analysis and some smaller short answer questions to work with. And then here follow the sources. And we have a Napoleonic proclamation in December of 1805. And again, this is about Austerlitz. This one concerns itself with Austerdat. And there's Blücher. We'll hear about him later on, with the Waterloo Campaign. And a primary source from a letter. And in his memoirs, dictated in exile. So this is from Napoleon, trying to perhaps be something of a self-apologetic while he's on the island. Now, 1823, that's when they're published. He passes in 1821. And I think the ordering of the sources is probably pretty important. So take heed here when you read source E. That's put there for a particular purpose. And then what I've done is I've broke these questions down for you. 1A, 1B, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and pretty well given you how these questions should be answered. Okay, now I don't think I clearly would not call that a proper response as it is. This is meant to be prescriptive guidance for you as you practice to write something quite articulate, clearly. Okay, and I'm going to end here with a number of possible Napoleonic LEQs. Okay, these will fundamentally cover everything that could possibly be asked about Napoleon. So if you need any help, it's strategicstudyskills@gmail.com.